There exists a profound psychological paradox that Carl Jung would have recognized immediately, one that empaths face every single day, yet rarely understand. In public spaces, empaths are celebrated. They're called sensitive souls, natural healers, and emotionally intelligent. People seek them out for advice, comfort, and understanding. They're praised for their ability to read between the lines, to sense what others cannot. But behind closed doors, in intimate relationships, family dynamics, and close friendships, the very same empathic abilities that earn public admiration become sources of deep, unspoken resentment. The empath finds themselves walking on eggshells, accused of being too sensitive, manipulative, or difficult. They're told they overthink everything, or make others feel guilty just by existing. Why does this happen? Why are the same qualities that make empaths beloved in public settings transformed into sources of tension in private? The answer lies not in the empath themselves, but in the hidden psychological forces that govern human relationships, forces that Jung understood better than perhaps any psychologist before or since. This is not a coincidence. It is not fate in the simple sense. What we're witnessing is the activation of what Jung called the shadow, the unconscious repository of everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. When an empath enters a social space, they become what Jung would recognize as a living mirror of the collective unconscious, reflecting not just emotions, but the hidden psychological contents that others have spent their lives trying to suppress. In public settings, this mirroring function feels safe. The empath validates feelings that others experience but cannot name. They provide the emotional vocabulary for experiences that remain trapped in the unconscious. When someone says, "You just get it," what they're really expressing is relief that someone else can articulate the psychological reality they've been carrying in silence. The empath becomes a bridge between the conscious and unconscious minds of others. But here's where Jung's insights become crucial. This same function that feels healing in public becomes threatening in private. In intimate relationships, the stakes are higher. The shadow contents that empaths reflect are not just general human struggles. They become specific, personal, and undeniable. When an empath lives close to someone, they inevitably begin to mirror back that person's deepest wounds, unprocessed traumas, and carefully hidden emotional patterns. The empath doesn't do this intentionally. It's simply their nature to absorb and reflect the emotional field around them. But for the non-empath, this creates what Jung would call shadow confrontation, the uncomfortable experience of seeing their own psychological contents reflected in another person. The very sensitivity that made the empath valuable as a confidant or advisor becomes perceived as invasive, judgmental, or manipulative when it occurs within the vulnerable space of an intimate relationship. Consider how this plays out practically. In public, when an empath senses someone's hidden sadness and offers comfort, they're praised for their intuition. But when that same empath senses their partner's suppressed anger or fear and attempts to address it, they're accused of creating drama or being too intense. The difference isn't in the empath's behavior, it's in the psychological safety of the observer. Public interactions allow for emotional distance. Private relationships demand psychological proximity that many find unbearable. Jung understood that most people live in what he called unconscious identification. They are so merged with their persona, their public mask, that they've forgotten the shadow aspects of their personality even exist. The empath's natural ability to sense and respond to these shadow elements creates a constant state of low-level psychological tension for those around them. It's as if the empath is continuously knocking on doors that others have deliberately locked and forgotten about. It is rarely about the empaths themselves. It is about what the empath reflects to them. When someone feels inexplicably irritated by an empath's presence, when they find themselves making cutting remarks or minimizing the empath's concerns, they're not responding to the empath's actual behavior. they're responding to their own psychological contents being mirrored back to them in ways they cannot control or predict. This creates what psychologists call projection, the unconscious transfer of one's own psychological material onto another person. The empath becomes a screen onto which others project their disowned emotions, their unacknowledged needs, and their suppressed vulnerabilities. When someone accuses an empath of being manipulative, they're often projecting their own discomfort with emotional manipulation they've experienced or perpetrated. When they claim the empath is too sensitive, they're protecting themselves from acknowledging their own suppressed sensitivity. The cruel irony is that the empath's greatest gift, their ability to feel deeply and authentically, becomes the very thing that triggers others' psychological defenses. In Jung's framework, the empath represents what he called the feeling function, one of 4 primary psychological functions that most people develop unevenly. In a culture that often prioritizes thinking over feeling, many individuals have underdeveloped emotional intelligence. The empath's natural feeling function serves as a constant reminder of what they've sacrificed in their own psychological development. Consider the family dynamics that often surround empaths. The empathic child who senses unspoken tension between parents and tries to address it is labeled difficult or attention-seeking. But what's really happening is that the child's natural empathic abilities are threatening the family's carefully constructed emotional equilibrium. The parents have likely developed elaborate defense mechanisms to avoid confronting their relationship issues, and the empath child's attempts to bring these into consciousness feel like attacks on their psychological survival strategies. This pattern repeats in romantic relationships, friendships, and workplace dynamics. The empath's natural tendency to create emotional honesty and authenticity collides with others' need to maintain psychological safety through emotional distance and denial. The closer the relationship, the more threatening the empath's abilities become, because intimacy increases the intensity of the mirroring effect. Jung observed that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When someone feels consistently irritated by an empath's presence, it's an invitation to examine what aspects of themselves they're avoiding. The empath is simply the catalyst for this self-confrontation. But most people lack the psychological sophistication to recognize this dynamic. Instead, they blame the mirror for showing them what they don't want to see. The empath thus becomes a scapegoat for others' psychological discomfort. They're carrying not just their own emotional reality, but the projected emotional contents of everyone around them. This creates an exhausting double bind. They're valued for their ability to hold space for others' emotions, but resented when that very same ability makes others uncomfortable with their own psychological contents. You may have noticed this pattern in your own life if you're an empath. Perhaps you've wondered why people seek you out when they're struggling, calling you their therapist friend, or saying you're so easy to talk to. They share their deepest secrets, cry on your shoulder, and express profound gratitude for your understanding. You feel valued, needed, even special for your ability to provide this emotional sanctuary. But then, in your closest relationships, this same gift becomes a source of conflict. Your partner accuses you of analyzing everything when you notice their mood shifts. Your family members roll their eyes when you express concern about underlying tensions. Friends begin to pull away when you consistently sense the emotions they're trying to hide. You start to wonder if there's something wrong with you, if you're truly too much, as you've been told. Have you ever felt confused by someone's anger toward you when you were simply trying to understand or help? Have you noticed that people often seek your emotional support, but rarely offer the same depth of emotional presence in return? This isn't because you're demanding or needy. It's because your natural way of being in the world activates psychological processes in others that they don't understand and can't control. The gaslighting often becomes internalized. You begin to doubt your perceptions, wondering if you're imagining the emotional undercurrents you sense so clearly. You might start suppressing your natural empathic responses, trying to be less intense or more normal. But this creates a painful internal split. You're denying the very essence of who you are to accommodate others' discomfort with their own psychological material. This recognition is crucial. The problem isn't your sensitivity. The problem is living in a world where most people are disconnected from their own emotional reality and therefore threatened by anyone who can see clearly into that realm. Your empathic abilities aren't a flaw to be fixed. They're a natural psychological function that reveals important truths about the emotional environment around you. The discomfort others feel in response to your presence is information about their own psychological state, not evidence that you need to change. At its deepest level, the empath represents what Jung called an archetypal figure, a universal pattern that appears across cultures and throughout history. In mythology, we see this archetype in figures like the oracle, the seer, the wounded healer, and the sacred witness. These figures were simultaneously revered and feared, sought out for their wisdom, yet kept at the margins of society because their abilities made others uncomfortable. The empath embodies what Jung identified as the principle of asteros, the force of connection, relationship, and emotional truth. In a world increasingly dominated by logos, logic, analysis, and emotional detachment, the empath serves as a reminder of what we've lost in our collective psychological development. They carry the feeling function not just for themselves, but for the collective unconscious of their communities. This is why empaths often feel like they don't belong, like they're from another world or another time. They're carrying psychological functions that our culture has devalued and suppressed. Their natural way of being represents a more integrated approach to human consciousness, one that honors both thinking and feeling, both individual needs and collective emotional health. The secret resentment that empaths face in private relationships stems from what Jung called the inferior function, the psychological capacity that individuals develop least. For most people in our thinking-dominated culture, the feeling function remains underdeveloped and unconscious. The empath's natural expression of this function creates shame and inadequacy in others, triggering defensive responses that can range from subtle dismissal to overt attack. But there's a deeper spiritual dimension to this dynamic. The empath often serves as what mystics call the sin eater, someone who absorbs and processes the collective emotional toxicity of their environment. They're natural transmuters of psychological energy, taking in heavy emotions and transforming them through the alchemy of conscious feeling. This is exhausting, sacred work that rarely receives recognition or appreciation. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, required integrating all aspects of the psyche, including the feeling function that empaths naturally embody. In this sense, empaths are evolutionary agents, modeling a more integrated way of being human. Their presence challenges others to develop their own emotional intelligence and psychological wholeness. The resistance empaths face isn't personal, it's archetypal. They're confronting the collective human tendency to split off and deny uncomfortable emotions. Every time an empath chooses to remain authentic rather than conform to others' emotional numbness, they're contributing to the psychological evolution of human consciousness itself. This understanding reframes the empath's struggles from personal inadequacy to collective healing work. The loneliness, the misunderstanding, the secret resentment they face, these are not signs that something is wrong with them. They're signs that they're fulfilling an important psychological and spiritual function that the collective consciousness isn't yet ready to fully embrace. Understanding these psychological dynamics doesn't eliminate the challenges of being an empath, but it provides a crucial framework for navigating them with greater wisdom and self-compassion. The first step is recognizing that the discomfort others feel around your empathic nature is not your responsibility to fix. You cannot heal someone else's relationship with their own emotional reality by dimming your light or suppressing your natural gifts. Boundaries become essential, but not the kind of boundaries that require you to become someone you're not. Instead, these are energetic boundaries. the ability to sense others' emotions without taking responsibility for changing or managing them. When you feel someone's hidden anger or suppressed sadness, you can acknowledge it internally without needing to address it directly. Sometimes the most healing thing you can do is simply hold space for emotional truth without trying to fix or change anything. Practice discernment in your relationships. Notice the difference between people who appreciate your depth and those who consistently make you feel like you're too much. The right people, your soul tribe, will recognize your empathic abilities as gifts rather than threats. They'll feel safe rather than defensive in the face of your emotional authenticity. These relationships may be rarer, but they're infinitely more nourishing than trying to constantly adjust yourself to accommodate others' psychological limitations. Develop your own emotional regulation practices. Because empaths naturally absorb emotional energy from their environment, you need regular practices that help you differentiate between your emotions and others. This might include meditation, time in nature, creative expression, or somatic practices that help you discharge absorbed energy and return to your own emotional center. Most importantly, trust your perceptions. The gaslighting that empaths experience is real, but it doesn't mean your intuitive insights are wrong. When someone tells you you're being too sensitive or overthinking, remember that this often means you're sensing something they don't want to acknowledge. Your sensitivity is not a flaw. It's a sophisticated psychological capacity that provides valuable information about the emotional environment around you. Choose consciousness over conformity. Every time you honor your empathic nature rather than suppressing it to make others comfortable, you're contributing to a more emotionally honest and psychologically integrated world. The secret resentment you face as an empath is not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of a world that has forgotten how to feel deeply and authentically. You are not too sensitive. The world has become too numb. You are not too intense. Others have learned to live at the surface when you naturally swim in depths. Your empathic abilities are not a burden to be managed, but a sacred gift to be honored. You are the keeper of emotional wisdom in a culture that has forgotten its value. You are the bridge between the conscious and unconscious, the feeling heart in a thinking-dominated world. Do not shrink to accommodate others' discomfort with their own psychological contents. Instead, let your authenticity be a beacon for those ready to embrace their own emotional depth. The world needs your sensitivity, your insight, and your courage to feel fully in an age of emotional numbness. Shine without apology, feel without shame. The future belongs to those brave enough to live with open hearts in a defended world.